In many eras of Jedi and Sith, holocrons, short for holographic chronicles, were the cornerstone of learning the ways of the Force. The voices of the ancients provided unparalleled knowledge and wisdom that could potentially give life into a brand new era of wielders of the Force. There are entire stories and adventures that surround collecting these ancient devices. Even whole wars have been fought over them before. This is because sometimes they may contain just one scrap of information, one thing that will change everything. But oftentimes when we see a holocron, it is an ancient relic of a bygone era, crafted by masters who have been dead for hundreds, or in some cases thousands of years. This has prompted an astute question from one of our acolytes in our own archives. How can no mainline person, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin, Vader, make holocrons of their own? Or even Yoda? Why were they content to study the knowledge of the ancients, never provide what they learned for future generations? Why has it seemed that the traditional practice of both Jedi and Sith has fallen out of style by the era of the Clone Wars and beyond? Well, today, my friends, like many of these very specific questions, there is no very specific answer, but rather several factors. So join us today as we learn the truth of why no mainline character seems to have ever made a holocron. Upon first thinking about the question, we were quite stumped, because first looking into it, there is honestly no good reason given why they don't. We would be led to believe that they would have important secrets of the Force, or would make some groundbreaking discoveries in order to be worthy of making a holocron, but none of them do. And also, this just wasn't true at all. There were many Jedi in times of past that used holocrons as personal journals, but they were preserved because of their personal insights, as they were seen as valuable and great wisdom. The Sith even kept Darth Vectivus's holocron despite the fact that he mainly stored within it business ledgers and just used it as an accounting PC. Point is that many powerful knowledge and artifacts that reshape one's entire destiny is not always the reason a holocron has to be made. Our main cast of characters would have been well aware of this, so why didn't any of them make holocrons of their own? The primary reason is that knowledge on how to make them was extremely limited, not completely lost, but definitely difficult to come by. The Jedi archives contain very little information on how to actually craft a holocron, as that knowledge is reserved for only Jedi Masters. Only members of the Jedi High Council were even allowed to enter the holocron vault at all in the archives. The Council of First Knowledge were able to retrieve them for study only when the High Council approved of it. Not even Jocasta knew when inside the holocron vault very often. Typically, it was the duty of the Education Corps to delve into holocrons, to transcribe their data into a physical form, forms that are then directly submitted into the Jedi archives. But from what we can understand, the knowledge of how to make a holocron was not recorded on these data tapes like the rest of the information. This was purposefully left within the holocrons themselves, kept away from the public eye and undeserving Jedi. This is the most basic explanation that we can find as to why someone like Anakin never made a holocron. He didn't know how to because he wasn't a master, and he couldn't access holocrons without the Council's approval first. And when the Jedi Order fell and Order 66 was commenced, the knowledge on how to make a holocron was nearly extinct because it all fell into the hands of a single man. That man was not Vader. That man was our regular culprit, Darth Sidious. Unfortunately, although we delved deep, we couldn't find a lot of knowledge on why the Council limited access to crafting holocrons, but we do have a guess. It is because these objects are sacred. They likely don't want to dilute the pool of holocrons that they had with any random master that input their worthless thoughts into a glorified journal. And besides, most Jedi Masters simply didn't have enough information to warrant creating a holocron in the first place. It became considered a great honor as time went on, and they held a lot more significance than in the bygone era. It was not uncommon in the slightest for a holocron to contain multiple Jedi gatekeepers. It was simply easier, much less time consuming to do that than to go and practice the making a new holocron. Not to mention, the Great Holocron of the Jedi Order was of paramount importance to them. The Great Holocron was a massive repository containing the wisdom and experience of not one, but dozens, if not hundreds of Jedi Masters throughout all of history. Many members of the Clone Wars High Council added their own entries into the Great Holocron, usually if they specialized in a certain area of the Force or had experience that warranted recorded into the deeper histories of the Jedi. Case in point, right after one was knighted, Obi-Wan Kenobi was instructed to make his own entry into the Great Holocron. His duty was to recall his duel with Darth Maul, the first duel with a Sith Lord in centuries. As far as the Jedi knew at this time, this has been the first killing of a Sith Lord by a Jedi in around 1,000 years. Plo Koon also made an entry into the holocron about his discovery of the Force ability Electric Judgment. What's interesting about including these entries in the Great Holocron is that it wasn't always about the Jedi themselves purposely talking to the holocron to record their knowledge. Rather, the Order would put anything in a holocron that they deemed valuable. But it was not the choice of Obi-Wan or Plo Koon, rather the Council. We also know that the Great Holocron was recorded within it lessons, hologram communication logs, or even mission reports. Mace Windu's entry about Vapad was just a private holo meeting between himself, Yoda, Saesee Tiin, and other prominent Jedi. Yarel Poof's entry was a lecture about recording how to use Force illusions. Saesee Tiin's entry was a mission report about the inspecting of Darth Maul's ship, and so on and so forth. This single holocron was so spectacularly powerful and useful to the Jedi that it accomplished its ultimate purpose, and it was able to breathe new life into a new generation of Jedi. The discovery of the Great Holocron was invaluable to Luke Skywalker's Jedi Order. It saved him in actuality, and they were finally able to use the wisdom and the knowledge of the Old Order in order to augment Luke Skywalker's own new evolution. And although it wasn't within the Great Holocron, even Anakin Skywalker was given a massive honor of having an entry somewhere. The holocron used by Kanan Jarrus contained a recording of a lesson that Anakin had given at one point to a class of students. It was likely that the High Council recognized his great skill in lightsaber combat, and not only asked him to teach this lesson, but then that he had the recording placed within the holocron. The bottom line for this section is that maintaining the sanctity of Holocron's existence was a huge deal to the Jedi, but it was also admittedly a matter of convenience. Darth Bane had this all figured out, and he went through a great deal to learn as much as he could about holocrons. For a long time, he even made it his life's mission. We won't go over the greater details today, but it often took at least a month in extreme deep meditation with absolutely no distractions to craft a holocron. It was an intense experience. The wiring of these precious devices was exhaustingly precise. If one microscopic element was out of place, the entire thing would crumble into dust upon activation. Once the Republic Classic era hit, and especially into the era of the Clone Wars, none of the Jedi could afford to take themselves off of the front lines of combat, or away from their council duties, for that amount of time, especially not someone like Obi-Wan Kenobi. As the leader of the 212th Attack Battalion, Obi-Wan was constantly on the move, and always on missions. The Clone Wars may have been only about 3 years in its totality, but there was not a single week that Obi-Wan and the Jedi weren't having to deal with some sort of crisis, so taking a vacation to craft a holocron was not feasible. Once the Clone Wars was over, Obi-Wan had all the time in the world on Tatooine though, but even then creating a holocron for him was not ideal. The famous journals of Obi-Wan were a collection of paper manuscripts that formed an autobiography, and lots of important information that was left for Luke. Obi-Wan spent his exile writing these letter-bound journals, drawing lightsaber blueprints, all of which he would place in a trunk, and that he would hide beneath his floor. Obi-Wan knew that by the time that Luke found them, he wouldn't be trained in the Force enough to open a holocron, and even if he was, it would be more than likely that the boy wouldn't even know how the holocron would function or what it even was, that it could open in the first place at all. The safest bet was to give him a book that he could pick up and read, but in order to protect it from unwanted eyes, Obi-Wan placed a thumbprint lock on the trunk, one that would only open for Luke's DNA. If someone attempted to force it open, Obi-Wan had placed a flash packet on the inside that would cause the trunk to explode into flames, destroying all of his work. This is how valuable it was to him, and this was the only type of security that he had that the holocron would have offered in greater return. But most fascinating of all, Sidious explains why he chose to never make a holocron. The way that he tells it, he did not intend his knowledge to ever outlive him, nor did he expect to be succeeded by another Dark Lord of the Sith. This was the purpose of a holocron after all, to leave one's legacy behind in the form of knowledge and wisdom. What's interesting though, is Darth Sidious did say that he was not so selfish as to not at least provide some vision of what he had experienced. And so he wrote a manifesto that he called the Dark Side Compendium, and submitted fragments of the works into the Telos Holocron, which is the Sith equivalent to the Great Holocron. Some time ago, we made an entire video on why Vader never created a holocron, but to summarize what we found there, Vader again didn't know how. But he also had no care for the future generations of Sith, and was never encouraged by Palpatine to construct one. Both of them intended to rule forever, so there was no need for them to spend time on useful topics like holocrons, especially because he was busy being the emissary of the Emperor and the Emperor's fist. And so, for all intents and purposes, there were various reasons why no one in the main cast ever made their own holocron, but luckily, we don't have to leave it off here, because one of them actually did. We misled you from a certain point of view. Grandmaster Yoda did make a holocron. The holocron of Yoda is one of the most elusive artifacts following the Jedi Purge. Like most things about the Grand Master, it was set apart by being much smaller than normal holocrons were. This makes sense because each one of these devices are meant to be personally tailored to the personality of the maker. The only thing we know of its contents were that it contained Yoda's wisdom, and aspects, and an exploration of the Jedi Code. But if we were to guess the other contents, it is more than likely that it contained his autobiography, and many insights into the living Force, perhaps even his experience with the Force priestesses and the wellspring of life. The first and only time it's mentioned in all of Star Wars lore is in a 38-page Coruscant Nights Part 1 Jedi Twilight. This is the only source we could find. During Operation Nightfall, a very young Jedi by the name of Jax Paven was collecting a great many holocrons in his frantic escape, and among these was the miniature holocron of Grandmaster Yoda. It is unknown what happened to it after this point, as Jax presumably stashed them somewhere while he was being hunted by Vader. Luckily though, it is not lost to history. Jax Paven survived his encounters with Vader and the Inquisitorius, and would continue to live on as an Order 66 survivor. But only he knows where the location of Yoda's holocron is, and hopefully, that information did not die with him. So, somewhere out there, Yoda's holocron remains hidden, not even where the Grand Master knows. But anyway, my friends, I hope that this answered a deep question for one of you, and we are happy to receive the request for this video. Again, if you guys have any questions that you desperately want answered, be sure to comment them down below, and we will dive as deep into the lore as we can. But again, thank you so much for joining us today and watching the video, and may the Force be with you.